welcome to Simcast, a podcast brought to you by the Society for Imaging, Informatics, and Medicine. Greetings, Simcasters. This episode covers the topic of the recently published IHE white paper on AI interoperability. Our hosts, Mohanad, Jason, Prasanth, and Ali will interview Dr. Chris Roth, who serves as Vice Chairman of Radiology and Information Technology and Clinical Informatics at Duke University, Brad Genereaux, who is Medical Imaging and Smart Hospitals Alliance Manager at NVIDIA, and Kevin O'Donnell, who serves as a Senior R&D Manager at Kennett Medical Research USA. The discussion will cover the inception of the paper, particularly how the stakeholders were able to get together, and will highlight for us the tremendous number of stakeholders' input required to put together this truly massive piece of work. We'll also get a glimpse into how, in the future, this white paper may be used to carve out several new IHE profiles. It's a really interesting discussion and covers a topic that I think will become clear is relevant to anyone involved in imaging informatics, whether it's from the technical engineering side, research, and of course, direct patient care. For those interested in learning more, resources will be provided in the show notes. Please enjoy.
Thank you to our guests for joining us today. I want to start with Brad and Kevin. So for the uninitiated, can you please take a step back and explain why IHE and why this paper?
Sure. I guess the first thing to understand is that IHE is about tailoring and testing standards. Tailoring means we write these implementation guides that we call profiles that tell vendors how to use particular standards in particular ways to solve a certain problem. And then the testing is we bring our products to Connectathon. And clearly, AI needs this. The goal is to get all of the different products from different vendors to be interoperable. That's obviously going to be an issue in the AI space. The problem is that it is such a big space. There are so many moving parts. And so Chris and the planning committee chose this white paper as the starting priority. And so the goal was to try and map out the problem space, to map out what are some of the applications of AI, how are we using AI in imaging, and then start to identify the separable chunks of that problem space that we might be able to write profiles around. That's what Brad refers to as the life cycle of an AI model. And so the goal of the white paper is really, honestly, we wrote it for ourselves initially so that we'd be able to figure out what we're going to do. What's our roadmap look like for the next, however many years it's going to take.
Here's my take. I want to take you back to 2018. So we all gathered, I believe it was in San Francisco at CMIMI 2018. Fantastic conference, best and brightest in the industry. And at the end of the meeting, Dicom, HL7, IHE, and all the representatives kind of hung around after the event. And we actually held a Dicom joint imaging integration meeting. It was phenomenal. And we all kind of took a step back and looked at what we're doing in the industry for AI, and in particular, building interoperable solutions. It was great to hear, perspectives from clinicians, from thought leaders, from vendors, from everybody kind of weighing in to say, where do we need to solve this problem? And the answer is everybody needs to solve this problem. In terms of how do we build sustainable, resilient, scalable solutions, there's a role for Dicom to play for being able to take images and imaging and metadata into algorithms. There's a role for HL7 to how we connect those things into the EMR. And there's a role for IHE to help guide us on how we create profiles to actually explain step-by-step how we do this. From 2019 to 2020, we actually, in IHE, created two fantastic profiles to help guide us with this. We have AIWI, which is AI workflow for imaging, and we have AIR, AI results. Both are used in tandem to describe the inference workflow. AIWI helps guide us to say, I've got an imaging study. How do I get an inference result? Is it this condition? What do I want to segment? And AIR tells us how we would communicate that result to say, this is the annotation, this is the segmentation, it is this thing according to what the AI application told us. Great place to start. But there's so much more to AI than just that very narrow inference band to say, I have an application, I'm going to do something with it. And there's many different tiers kind of beyond that. And so we started to map this out. And we said, rather than create more profiles to say, let's do a training workflow and let's do a data set workflow, let's actually take a step back and look at the entire ecosystem and write something that helps guide us in industry together with our clinician thought leaders and vendors to build out the ecosystem together. And this is where the white paper really came from, to identify all the different steps end to end, looking at inference as one piece, but what bookends that in terms of creating repositories or creating data sets or validating studies or training models or getting feedback. We looked at all of these things to actually create this white paper, and that's where we are today.
I would add a couple of things to Brad and Kevin. For the docs that are on, and for those who may be less familiar with what IHE is, to zoom way out for a minute. IHE is a group of volunteers that are supported and sponsored through RSNA to really, in my opinion, create a vision, create kind of the future interlinking of standards to improve healthcare, specifically in imaging, but there are lots of IHE domains that are not in imaging. But for this audience, it's radiology. It's really to get the right people in the room to define, here's the problem. Here is a problem that we see coming. What standards can we stitch together? How can we use the existing platform type infrastructure that's there to solve this in a vendor neutral way that anybody can buy into? There are two IHE committees. There's the IHE. IHE is integrating the healthcare enterprise. And there's the IHE Planning Committee, which is vendors and also clinical people. There are certainly some consultants and other people as part of IHE planning, but really it's the group that directs a second group that is the IHE Technical Committee. The IHE Technical Committee really is the brains of the operation. And technical really looks at the standards in gory detail and says, okay, on the basis of what this problem is, what can we use to solve it? Brad referred to AIWI and AIR, right? These are workflow and resulting problems that are understood by clinical people, understood to be high value to clinical people. How can we take the request of IHE planning and make a profile, make a workflow, make a set of standards, talk to each other in a way that solves this problem for everybody? So it was IHE planning that really decided that of all of the suggested things to solve, a couple of years ago, we decided that AIWI and AIR were the highest importance ones. The year after that, we realized, to Brad's point, that there's still a heck of a lot we didn't know. There's so many other opportunities that are out there. There's so many other profiles that are out there. There's so much additional knowledge with people who understand parts of it, and it would be nice to put them all together. That created the AI white paper, which has been a tremendous success. And we're extending now into additional profiles that come from the AI white paper that I'm sure Brad and Kevin are going to talk about shortly.
Well, thank you very much. Very thorough answer on that. I guess that this leads us to the audience of this paper. Who is this primarily written for? Is it for technical folks? Is this for the vendor community so they know what to do? Or are we hoping that consumers would provide this to the vendors and instruct them? So who is the audience for this?
As I was kind of alluding initially, we largely wrote it for ourselves. And so because we needed to get our arms around this hydra that is AI. As Chris was alluding, you put AI into a hospital and it's connected to everything. You think about, well, the model is running here, but how does the model get its input? Where does it put its outputs? How did you install this from the vendor? How did the model get trained? How did you validate the model locally? It's just connected to so many things. And, I think there's a lot of hospitals out there that the IT staff, the clinical planning group are going through the same kinds of grappling exercise. And so I think the white paper is certainly useful to those groups as well, just to get a handle on what is the breadth of AI and start to get a feeling for what the pipeline looks like. What are the main gears in this machine? And to have a way to start thinking about how you're going to build out your infrastructure. So mostly for ourselves, but I think the content is very broadly applicable.
I would add, in my opinion, who should be reading this paper? Everybody. Maybe I'm biased. I think it's a fantastic paper, but I honestly think that there's something in this document for everybody. There's a whole section that walks through all of the different applications of AI, all the way through from orders to like population health, departmental analytics, and beyond. There's all of the workflows from creating repositories all the way through to getting feedback and acting upon it. There's a whole block that steps through. These are the different types of objects and the common services that are needed in order to make this whole system work. Part of the challenge that we see definitely in this space, it's getting better, but, thinking back 3-4 years ago, and we're at a point where we say, I would like AI. And that doesn't mean anything. That is such a hollow statement because AI could be a million different things. And we all need the language to be able to say, this is actually what I want. This is actually the challenge that I want to address in my clinic, in my workflow, for my patients, for my staff. How do I convey that to others so that we all understand what is the problem that is facing us and how do we solve it together? And I think that this white paper really lays out, this is exactly the types of steps that we would follow. And this is the problem point. This is the entry point. This is the exit point for us to actually build those workflows. So I think that it should be informaticists. It should be developers for vendors. It should be developers at hospitals and academic institutions, really so that we all can speak the same language to convey what we're actually trying to solve.
I think there's a couple of adds to what Brad said, and that is one thing that I think we've all learned as part of an imaging informatics community that we exist in professionally and we immerse ourselves in to some degree personally, is we don't know everything, right? We know a lot. We know what we know. There's a heck of a lot that we don't. And there is something in this paper for everybody. You don't need to read the entire thing, but very quickly reading through it, I know I learned a lot. Any physician is going to learn from this. Any industry professional is going to learn from this because maybe they understand the viewer part of it, but they don't understand the EHR. Maybe they understand this other part of it, but not something else. There's a lot in here. And you'll very quickly be able to sort of scan through and realize what parts are high value to you and what parts aren't. So I think to ask anybody to read all 153 pages is a task. I did. I felt reading it like I was reading the meaningful use legislation from about a decade ago. It's a lot and it's dense, but you're able to really pick up a lot of information of what's in here. And it's going to be beneficial to you because you will see the much broader picture than what you are familiar with today.
Yeah, I think that last point in particular about the broader picture that Brad alluded to a section. So section 2 of the white paper is where we talk about all the different places where AI would be potentially applied in the imaging pipeline. And before the white paper, I think we suffered from what I sometimes call the redwood effect. We couldn't see the forest because there was this enormous one tree that everybody was looking at, that the use of AI on images to create potential findings just sucked all the air out of the room. That was the use of AI to determine, well, is there potentially pneumonia here? Is there a stroke? And certainly there's a massive amount of development in that area. But there's 4 sections in section 2 before that, and there's another 4 after that AI is being applied to image reconstruction, to preparing the patient for the scan, to scheduling, to Brad listed a number of those earlier. So for most of the listeners to this podcast, section 2 is probably accessible to everybody. And really just to get a full sense of the breadth of AI in imaging, it's a good place to start. And as Brad was saying, the advantage of everybody reading it is getting us all on the same page so we can at least have meaningful conversations is also a huge plus.
I would even, Kevin, go as far as to say that if you are a director of imaging informatics or a vice chair of imaging informatics or somebody who wants to be in a position like that, it's required reading, because the knowledge that you're going to pick up in this very dense document is going to be the basis, the foundation of AI for the next 10 years. And I don't think that's hyperbolic to say. There are so many different workflows in here, standards that are integrated. You're going to be able to talk to your industry partners from it. It's a lot to read, but again, there is a lot here that you can learn from, especially if you're a clinician, to really see the whole picture.
And the good news is that that chunk of section 2 is only 8 pages. So if you want something less than 150, there's a good place to start.
This is fantastic. And I'm loving the thorough responses. So thank you. Just a quick question to step back. Listening to you talk about all the sections and just the scope and breadth of the paper, it sounds like a lot of work definitely had to go into this. Can you tell us more about what exactly it took to get this paper together and give us a better idea of exactly how much work from a time or a resource standpoint, either one, it took to get this together?
Hey, absolutely. So, as I said, the concept was many years in the making. We talked about it as everything evolved, but it really took putting down a proposal for IHE Radiology Planning Committee back in the summer of 2020. And so basically, we followed the same process for any profile or white paper, which is provide kind of a single one-pager of what are you setting out to do. We took that step, we took it to the committee, we got great feedback, and we created a detailed proposal, which laid that out. That got took back to the IHE Planning Committee, 2 thumbs up, let's roll with it. And we kicked off an authoring group, a mix of different vendors, different people from across the industry to take different chunks and write just the skeleton outline and iterate and reiterate and go over. But we took this to the technical committee at a number of different checkpoints. We had lots of different TCons to review content, to deep dive, did a lot of alignment with other industries to make sure that the concepts that we're bringing in was, aligned with what other industries are doing as well. So taking the best and brightest from general deep learning, machine learning techniques, strategies. There is a ton of reading that we all did, and we actually listed that in the bibliography at the end. So I think that there's something like 75 or 100 papers, documents, links, all across not only healthcare, but beyond. And those are the things that went in to feed this paper to inform the concepts as we develop them in the context of medical imaging. And so we got to April and May of 2021, where important to note, we also had a public comment period. So at the end of February, this document in its form went out to the broad public to get a ton of feedback. I think we had something like, I want to say 190 bullet points of comments from the industry weighing in and saying, hey, you should look at this, you should look at this. Fantastic feedback. It was amazing feedback. And we took every single piece of what people suggested, weighted it carefully, and updated our document accordingly because of it. It was phenomenal. And then, as I said, we took it for final approval. It got published in, I believe it was October, that the final version was published, and it's been great ever since. So that's kind of how it rolled and how we got through it. I don't know, Kevin, anything you want to add to that I skimmed over?
Yeah, no, that was great. And 150 pages doesn't write itself. You'll see a bunch of names at the top of the document, but really the entire radiology technical committee helped in developing it, helped in reviewing it, helped in resolving the questions and comments. I think we had more hours of teleconferences on this work item than we have for any IHE work item in the past 5 years. So it was a huge amount of work to put all this together. And the one thing I'd add to Brad's comments, we got wonderful feedback on the public comment period, which demonstrated the breadth of interest in the community. And one thing that was unusual for this one is the amount of feedback we got from clinical people, that a lot of times it'll be the engineers and the companies who are responding. Chris may have some additional comments, but there were a lot of radiologists who gave us a lot of good, both technical and clinical feedback on the concepts.
So 150 plus pages certainly didn't write itself. And I want to give you and all the people who participated here a heck of a lot of credit, because it was a lot of time. It was especially a lot of time on you both, Brad especially. By the way, the same people that wrote this paper are the same ones that write the profiles in other years. So they're the ones that really participated heavy in AIW, AIR, this year in AI root results and interactive multimedia reporting. The other profiles that volunteers in our imaging informatics community care enough about people like me in the clinical environment and the patients that I take care of, to devote their time to bend reality for these patients and create profiles that are beneficial, create white papers that disseminate the knowledge that lots of people can pick up. So to put something together like this was a lot of work. And on behalf of all of us who are consuming this, I participated in some small way, but really all of us who are consuming this, all the patients who are going to benefit from it, thank you. For me, I'll say that one of the biggest benefits I saw from this, honestly, was I felt a sense of relief, because I feel like people like Kevin and Brad in the committee that wrote this get it. A lot of the questions that I'd had along the way, they got answered here. It was something that it filled in a bunch of gaps. Yeah, it's long, but those contexts, those details matter. So I think to answer the question of, what really happened here, there were a bunch of people that cared a lot to share the knowledge that they have with the community at large, so that we all, on the provider side, the industry side, and the patient side, can benefit.
One thing that I'll also add, and Kevin, I think, can certainly speak to this a lot more, as we generally go through the IHE process in terms of looking at the proposals and making decisions on what work we take on for certain years, there's a very robust scoring system with uncertainty points, complexity points, and we use those to actually make how much work can we scope in a particular year. And if there's a lot of uncertainty or a lot of complexity, that makes it really difficult to be able to commit to a certain block of work to be done in a certain year. So in order for us to de-risk any future work in these spaces, it was so important that we spent time looking at the entire ecosystem, so that if we come down to the point and say, you know what, we really need to have an annotated data set profile that just describes this. And if we are all coming to that conversation with different ideas that would take it in different directions, to what is an annotation, and really even like having to debate this, not having done that up front would mean that the complexity, the uncertainty of that profile would take a lot more time for that particular year. And so with this paper, although all of the work that we put into to make this real, to make this live, to make this happen, we've de-risked creating profiles well into the future by being able to minimize the amount of uncertainty looking at a particular function in a broad ecosystem.
It's an excellent point that we do try and get a good handle before we dive into a profile. And when we looked at the whole AI space, that was, as I said, part of the motivation for doing this. And as Brad's describing, teasing out some of those hidden gotchas, and we won't find all of them, but that's what sets us up to do a successful profile. But I think that's also some of, to Chris's earlier point, some of the useful content for hospitals that are looking at this, that if it was a hidden gotcha for us, it's potentially a hidden gotcha for others. And so trying to tease out all of the different dimensions of what you're going to have to address when you install and start using AI is a community problem. And I think getting everybody on the same page, understanding the terms the same way, gets us further down the road so that we can do a better job when we tackle each piece.
Yeah. One thing I want to call out, I've mentioned more than once how much effort went into this. I don't want people who are on the fence thinking about participating in IHE to think that it's a salt mine, that it's a grind, it's a slog. It's not. It was actually really enriching conversation to be a part of. It's a really fun group to be a part of that anybody can learn from. So to advance the field, to advance the communications between the standards and advance patient care, these folks are putting in, their volunteer time to do it, and they're having a big, big impact. If you are not able or aren't sure about it, It doesn't mean you can't come be a part of IHE technical or IHE planning as an expert wallflower. You can. If you just want to be there to listen and contribute a little bit of help here and there, you absolutely can. And I think those kinds of folks are, anybody really, the people are the lifeblood of the IHE and advancing healthcare the way we are. So don't think because it was a lot of work that, there's really no place for me here. I don't have the time for this. You can scale up and scale down your involvement insofar as you want, but there is a lot for everybody within IHE.
And one thing, I love that sort of recruiting message in there, that one of the other things is you don't have to come with solutions, just come with some good questions and, you're helping the process. So getting all the variety of stakeholders involved has been helpful for us at every profile we've worked on, and we're particularly going to need it with AI.
So this is obviously very complex and has a lot of far-reaching tendrils, if you will. So if we look back historically, like at Dicom, right? They did an amazing job at balancing control with freedom to do different things. And they were very forward thinking with a lot of things. And one of these days, I want to get Steve Horry on this podcast so we can talk to him about this and learn from that. Because
Dr. Dicom.
Yeah, it just amazes me how they were able to do this and choosing different structural elements and things like that. So when you guys were bringing this all together, why did you choose certain structural elements? For example, the persona setup. And how did you guys find your balance between keeping things general enough to allow for the flexibility, yet specific enough to give people the mile markers so they knew that we're on the right track? Let's start with Kevin.
Well, I'll hand off the personas to Brad because that was one of his brainchilds. But the philosophy within IHE is a cross-vendor effort. There's a lot of vendor involvement, but it's sort of a pre-competitive space. And so part of what we're doing is we're trying to write profiles when we get to the profile writing stage that everybody can buy into. It's a basis for us all to interoperate, but we don't want to hamstring everybody. And so the subtle balance that you referred to, one of the key things is nail down the plumbing that is how our systems connect, but keep the flexibility for all of the product features and the innovation and the creativity that goes on top of that. That we want to, with the profiles should be down at the lower level nuts and bolts, but there's still so much room for product design that helps make things easier for customers and users that IHE isn't going to get into. It's hard work and it requires a lot of creativity, and just getting the plumbing done is more than enough work for us. But that's a little bit of the split that we try and shoot for.
So for me, well, I'll start by saying that we looked at personas and use cases as a starting point for QA of the white paper. And let me explain what I mean by that. It's very easy from an engineering perspective to say, here's the problem. Okay, we need a model resource. We need a patient resource. We need an annotation resource. And it's very easy to kind of construct what this looks like. But what we wanted to do was really look at to make sure, are we covering 100% of the ecosystem? And in order for us to do that, we had to enumerate a bunch of different groups or topics or collections of ideas. And so if you look through each of the different structural elements, they actually bleed all the way through from section 2 through to section 4. So for example, and there's a great chart that we put in near the end of the paper writing process on a persona matching to use cases. You'll see a chart that says, here's the different personas: the data scientist, the radiologist, the chief privacy officer, the vendor, product managers at vendors, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And where do they come into the use case map? So who is creating repositories? Who is creating annotated data sets? Who's training models? Who's validating models? And, it depends on if it's a regulatory body or a clinical body or a payer body. And so by enumerating all of these things, we can make sure that we didn't miss anything when we were describing the use cases. We would look at a particular use case, and say, for example, adding clinical data to a pre-existing data set. Who would be involved in that? And what are they wanting to do? Why are they interested in that workflow? What do they expect to get out of it? Are we making sure to include those aspects in the broader set of use cases? And so, as I said, you'll see that from section 2, where we see the personas, and section 3, where we see the use cases, they're informing each other as we build those things out and scope them out. And so it was an incredibly useful way of slicing and dicing what this paper would look like, and helped us to make sure that we covered every single aspect from every different vantage point. So we're inclusive of everybody's workflow. At least for me, that's one of the key things of why we did that particular approach for the paper.
And just to underscore, it highlights the really multi-profession aspect of this paper, that lots of different people from lots of different professions came together to define not just what the persona is that they represent, but also how they play into this process. And it again highlights also why this is valuable to the broader community of imaging informatics, because I'm a neuroradiologist myself in my day job. I don't have a good sense. I have a pretty okay sense maybe of what happens in corporate America as industry develops these things, but I don't know all of it, right? I leaned on Kevin and Brad to share all of that with me, just like I shared, here's what population health and analytics on the front lines looks like on the hospital side. So that's really where this becomes educational for folks, is it's a multidisciplinary paper and anybody can get something out of it.
So we talked a lot about the work that went into the paper. We also talked about the great ideas that went into the paper, like the personas. I want to shift the topic just for a moment to something else that was also great work and a great idea. So Brad, you came up with a video that summarized the paper. I think it was a 5-minute video, if I remember correctly, or so. How did you come up with that? And what was that like?
Absolutely. That was a really fun piece of work to put together. When we were looking at preparing for public comment, and at that point, I think the document was 120 pages. And if we were to say, okay, everybody in the world, we'd love to get your feedback, woof, here's the whole guide. It's really trying to understand what the paper is all about and what parts of the paper are relevant to what different types of groups. Because, as we said, not every part is relevant or as usable. If you're writing software, you're going to be looking at really more of the use cases and just being informed by section 2. So what we want to do is really work to make it approachable. And if you just get like a 5-minute overview to say, here's the key points of the paper. This is the personas. These are the applications. Check the applications out. We'd love to get feedback on this area. Or here's the use cases. Here are the 7 groups of use cases that we've grouped them around. These are the most important concepts so that you can unlock the value of the paper, right? If you were to look at each use case, I think that there's probably 50 parts. There's like 7 or 8 in every of the verticals, and then another group of like 12 that are common across them all. We wanted to make it really easy and approachable, and just putting something short together so that you could just sit down over coffee and hear me talk about the various components of the paper would be a really approachable way to really just jump in and get familiar with the paper before actually doing a kind of line-by-line review. So that's kind of was the inspiration. I thought it'd be a really cool way from a media perspective just to build this up, get a podcast-esque piece out to share with the community. I love the feedback. I think it was really helpful for people. So I think that that's absolutely wonderful.
Thank you for that. And just quickly going back just a little bit in the conversation, for someone like me who's still pretty new to this field, can you describe the difference between what a profile is and what this paper represents?
Sure. So what we normally do, the majority of the IHE output are these profile documents, which are really step-by-step implementation instructions for the vendors of each of the different products that says, here's how you're going to set up your plumbing so that your, as Brad was describing earlier, your output connects into somebody else's input, and all of the things are closer to plug and play so that they're all adaptable. And the nice thing, it's very concrete. It's something we can take to the Connectathon. We can do tests on, which is the other advantage of IHE. Make sure your vendors have been to Connectathons to confirm that they don't just think they're following the spec, that they're demonstrated to be following the spec. Whereas if you go into this white paper, we sketch some of those concepts, but this was more about mapping out these use cases to really understand, for example, if we look at running and populating a repository, There is going to be so much data science and data management as hospitals get involved in doing AI and vendors are doing more development of it. Let's get some common understandings of how you populate repositories, how you manage them, how you exchange data between them, what kind of metadata you need to put on those data sets so that you're not accidentally using something for validation that's previously been used to train the model and thus is destroying the validity of your validation. It's a little circular, I guess. But so the white paper is really describing the problems with a few sketches about the solution, whereas the profiles get very specific and very concrete about the solution.
Great, thanks for that. So let's see if there's any more to pick on the bone on this. We've touched on a bit of this already, but curious, in what ways did you keep the profile open for future changes in the AI landscape? And maybe you could walk us through how people will use this document for something like creating an AI communication standard in the future. So let's maybe start with Kevin.
Brad was mentioning earlier about our proposal process. And so this is something that starts off in Chris's planning committee. And what we expect is over the next couple of years, people will reach into the white paper, eyeball it, and carve out maybe one or two chunks of section 3 to say, this feels like a 1-year piece of work to put together the specification. And so we expect to be able to use those to estimate how much of this do we have a firm grasp on, which parts are fuzzy, how much time are we going to need to spend clarifying that, how much time are we going to need to spend mapping out the technical details. So it's really going to feed, I believe, many years of future activities. Inevitably, though, I'm sure we've missed spots and the AI field continues to evolve. So we may well end up with the technical committee going back to the white paper and rewriting some sections or extending some sections at some point in the future based on the various turns as the technology matures. Brad, any thoughts?
Yeah, I would add that this is a community resource. It's a community roadmap that we all contributed to, that we all wrote, and that we will all benefit from. The paper is certainly not normative. And it's a guide, it's a guiding post to help us frame conversations into the future. Whether future profiles deviate from what we laid out, that's exactly the idea. I mean, really, once the rubber hits the road, this is the direction that we all need to go in. It makes perfect sense. And so really, the whole field is open, and this is a guide to help us frame those conversations for future work. And, IHE as an organization is super responsive in terms of being inclusive of communities and community input for profiles that come from this white paper. If there are change proposals, they have a very robust change proposal system that can listen and reflect and get feedback and ask questions and help to drive things forward. And that's one thing that is phenomenal about the entire IHE community.
So Kevin and Brad hit on something important, and that is this document cannot just sit there and collect dust. It has to be something that is a living document that is reviewed and refreshed regularly because the field changes so fast. IHE is valuable for somebody like me, and this white paper is valuable for somebody like me because I'm able to look at a vended product that's out there and ask if it is compliant, if it follows AIWI or AIR. I know that if I purchase it, it's going to behave like this and connect up to these other applications like that. And when you think about a document that's like that, you want to start thinking about what is it going to do now that it's public and out there beyond get refreshed and reviewed every so often. So one of the things that I'm talking about with Krishna Julru, who's the associate editor of Radiographics, what we're trying to do is make this white paper and different IHE profiles that are out there digestible in a way that is understandable and less overwhelming to physicians, radiology or non-radiology, about the community. You put something on PubMed, you put it in a journal, now lots of more people see it. And I think that's one of the nice things that's going to come from this as profiles develop. They're going to not just be on a white paper online and accessible through experts and videos, but also out there in the peer-reviewed community to show here's all the good work that's happening. Here are pieces of technology that are valuable to hospitals, and have them in a way that I could put in front of my chief medical information officer teammates or my compliance officers and have it be easy to understand. So I think that's part of what we're trying to do is take this and break it up into segments by the audience so that they know they can get something concise, readable, and at their level.
This has been awesome. Having read through as much of the paper as I could, I definitely can see where you guys were trying to put things together and whatnot. And I'll be honest, after a little bit of time, my eyes started glazing a touch and I had to go do something else, come back to it because it is so dense. It's got a lot in there. So I'm glad that there's some future work to break it up a little bit. And I definitely want to see Brad's video because that'll probably help give me a bit of an overview for it as well. So as we're kind of wrapping up this discussion, are there any other final thoughts or any other things that you want to highlight or specific themes that we didn't touch upon that you have a burning desire to talk about? Kevin, let's start with you.
Yeah, I'll just pick up on something that Chris was talking about a moment ago and sort of the evolutionary nature of the document. And we really saw the first phase of that during the public comment process. And one of the areas that we hadn't given full due coverage to in the white paper had to do with validation of algorithms at individual sites, that there was a lot of discussion. And this came from the feedback from folks like Chris and other clinicians at hospitals who were very concerned that there would be ways for them to give feedback as when an algorithm is operational, to be able to encode feedbacks and corrections to what the algorithm's doing so that there would be better support for continuous learning. And even when they're acquiring the algorithms in the first place, that they might want a deeper validation on a per site basis. And so filling out some of those details, understanding that setting up repositories wasn't just something for RSNA or the Cancer Imaging Archive, that this is something that most hospitals are probably going to end up doing, was a useful expansion. And I expect as the field matures, we'll see more of those sorts of fleshing out of different parts of the pipeline. But it also, I think, speaks to why it's useful for lots of people to read the paper, because as has been said numerous times, there's something for everybody to learn here.
My final thought is, certainly read the paper, read the parts that resonate with you, read the parts that don't. There's so much you can take from there and apply in your daily life. What I am so excited about is what comes next. The fact that we now all have a framework to create, to build, to iterate, to incorporate, to integrate, to provide feedback on for this entire space. We all have a community resource that we can build great things for our patients, for our physicians, for the other staff and the hospital. We can all benefit by having this framework out there so that we can all build the solutions together, holistically, end to end, incorporating all walks of life to make a real difference. So I'm super thrilled of having been a part of this and where we go from here. It is going to be a phenomenal decade of innovation, of building these things together. Super excited.
And one last time, Brad, Kevin, to the entire IHE community of volunteers, thank you on behalf of all of us who are taking care of patients and trying to bring the right technology in to do that. You guys put a lot of work in on this profile and others, again, on this white paper and all the profiles that you do. It's a labor of love, I know, and it's something that I know you genuinely care about. On behalf of all of us, thanks.
And thank you to all three of you for being here. I know this has been an absolutely exciting, at times enlightening. Actually, the whole thing was enlightening conversation. And I know that we could go on with many more follow-up questions, but we're unfortunately at that time. For our audience, we will post the link to the IHE white paper in our liner notes. So please look forward to that. Congratulations to all of you again on what I think is momentous for the field and for interoperability. And I hope I speak for all of us when I say that we're excited to see how things go in the next few years, if not more. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Simcast has been brought to you by the Society of Imaging Informatics and Medicine. Please visit our website at siim.org for more information and educational content, including webinars and an archive of prior episodes. Please follow us on Twitter at sim_tweets. Thank you to our listeners for your continued support.